I think that we shouldn't go over too quickly what the ambassador just said about the parallel system. That probably doesn't mean much to a lot of you, but for a very long time, ASEAN has been concerned with the problems in the South China Sea. And for years, Hashim Jalal, who is just now retired, his son was the ambassador here for Indonesia, conducted personal diplomacy on the second track, that is to say, the non-diplomatic track, but the informal processes under the aegis of the ASEAN countries. This kept the lid on the problems in the South China Sea for many years. And in fact, they died down so much that the efforts were really, of course, Hashim Jalal got older too, but they stopped. And now I was delighted to hear that the negotiations are resuscitated and are underway, and maybe even leading to more legally enforceable decisions than the voluntary compliance that was going on 10 years ago. So the parallel system is probably the answer. I'm a Law of the Sea Convention guy and can talk all you want about the case that's pending and the implications. Many times I have a minority view, which I'll quickly state as being that I think there's much more involved than the narrow issues that have been presented for decision. The case obviously concerns first jurisdiction and whether the declaration that China lodged at the time it became a party to the convention excluded territorial disputes, and is this a territorial dispute? And the effort on the part of the Philippines is to say it is not. The effort on the part of the Chinese is to say this is a matter of historic title and sovereignty, and we've exempted ourselves out from that. And the Law of the Sea Convention, as the ambassador correctly stated, does not deal with sovereignty issues. So that is underway. I hope that the arbiters have the judgment to look beyond the narrow issues that are presented, because there is much more involved. I think the fact that the Chinese have indicated a willingness to move within ASEAN should be a factor that they ought to consider more than the narrow provisions that are in the convention. So I'm happy to talk about islands or things like that if you want to talk about them. But I think that those are subsidiary. I think what really is involved here is finding some commonality. There is huge commonality between the United States and China on the question of freedom of navigation. Most of the oil that China gets comes through the South China Sea. If they were to take restrictive measures against navigation, they can fully expect that there will be restrictive measures that will be taken by others. And right now, Iran, which sits at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, and now is getting growing influence in the Bab el-Mandeb, in the entrance to the Red Sea, is sitting there, and it could really cause some difficulties with respect to freedom of navigation. So I think the United States and China are global powers. They ought to think like global powers. They don't have any interest that is promoted by having very restrictive local area or regional inhibitions placed on navigation. So I will only say my topic was terrorism, wasn't nearly as interesting as the South China Sea issues, which have all kinds of illegal immigration and smuggling and terrorism, maritime terrorism involved in it. But I think that all I really need to say is that the IMO has got a convention. It's long-winded Convention for the Suppression of Unlawful Acts Against Safety of Maritime Navigation, SUA, in 1988. My fellow panelist here, James Kraska, has written a really thick book about this sort of subject and knows much more about it than any of us need to know, certainly more than I know. And so if you have questions on SUA and terrorism, he's a good one to ask. If you want to ask what some of the questions that are inherent in the South China Sea case with respect to the UN Convention, I think I could help you on that. So, thank you.
About 1 week ago was in Vietnam, exercising CUES with the Vietnam People's Navy. CUES is a helpful addition to the stable of instruments that we have. It's a non-binding communications protocol to enhance safety and provide greater transparency among naval forces, and it was developed by the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, which is a group that was organized in 1988 and has 21 member states. CUES is mindful of the risks of maritime intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and so it leverages the collision regulations and it integrates the collision regulations in providing that warships should employ good seamanship and that they should avoid things that could, quote, endanger the object of surveillance or cause it to deviate from its intended course or speed. And so it has some specific prescriptions that are based upon the collision regulations, but it's uncertain, in my view at least, how useful CUES might be to prevent incidents on the water, because it does not apply to civil and commercial craft. It only regulates harassment by warships. And we've seen that over the past decade or so that there's been fewer incidents between warships and potentially more incidents involving that are operating in the gray zone, involving Coast Guard vessels or perhaps fishing vessels and coastal trawlers. So it's not as clear whether this, which is much more of sort of a Cold War instrument, would be that useful. The United States and China have also adopted a rules of behavior. This is rules of behavior to increase interoperability and predictive interaction. This photo is taken from RIMPAC. Of course, China participated in the recent RIMPAC, and the rules of behavior are an additional layer to try to build confidence and predictability in this relationship. Annex 1 of the rules say that each flag state should take necessary measures to ensure that military vessels flying its flag maintain safety at sea, and it also applies to warships and naval auxiliaries as well as state aircraft, which are recognized as enjoying sovereign immunity. Annex 2 of the rules set forth expectations of behavior for military and vessels that encounter each other at sea, and they should use active communications in order to avoid an incident. They should coordinate their movements and operate in accordance with several additional protocols, including the International Code of Signals, the radio regulations of the International Telecommunications Union, as well as the standard maritime communication, implementing standard maritime communication phrases. When warships encounter one another at sea, they should maintain a safe distance and avoid risk of collision. And if military vessels are restricted, then they should, in a restricted water space, then they should implement the rules that are found in coal rigs. So these are viewed as a cohesive whole. Finally, commanders of warships should, quote, avoid simulated attacks by aiming guns and other indicia of hostile intent. But this type of behavior, unfortunately, in my view, are not forbidden. They just says that it should be avoided. So again, I'm not sure why the negotiators couldn't reach, go from avoided to prevented, or to shall not do that sort of behavior. But I see that as a weakness. Finally, there's the notification of military activities, and this is designed to increase transparency for each country's security policy to exchange both documents as well as in-person or in situ participation in other exercises, exchange of views about major operations and exercises, and exchange of views on strategy to bring greater transparency to the relationship. It's not clear how far this will go or how much it will be implemented. For example, it's not clear whether the United States will be invited to be an observer in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and other Chinese-led and Chinese-initiated organizations, but we hope that they would follow sort of in line with the example of RIMPAC and be very accommodating in that regard. Finally, there's under discussion a third bilateral agreement with regard to aviation encounters, and hopefully that will be completed this year, because as we know, there have been recent aviation incidents that would be good to defuse or would be good to prevent. And so having a rule set based upon International Civil Aviation Organization and Article 3 status of sovereign immune status of military aircraft would go far toward building stability into the relationship. In conclusion, I think that it's helpful to have all of these instruments to broaden transparency. There are existing mechanisms such as the Notice to Mariners and Notice to Airmen, which already can provide a basis for avoiding misunderstanding. There are some other things up here as well, though, that are not covered, the last three bullets, and I know we'll hear a little more about some of these, but these are areas that are sort of at the higher end of major power competition, and I would suggest that maybe we have our work cut out for us as kind of an agenda going forward of things that we could focus on and build stability. Thank you.
Now our last panelist is Dr. Hong Nong.
On exploring the commonalities between the United States and China in the maritime domain, based on which they were looking for a maritime cooperation mechanism on a practical basis. But in order to do that, I would like to start with critical issues to identify what would be the divergence between these two countries. So I would like to put into three categories. First, on the maritime interests and also maritime strategies, and the different interpretation of the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention, and also looking to the legal culture of the two countries, based on which I'm going to imply actually what those divergent views are actually reflected in their different approaches when they are looking at the maritime dispute in the Asia Pacific. So let me start with the first one, and the different maritime interests actually would direct the two countries to interpret the different maritime strategy. For China, the most important concept is territorial disputes and maritime jurisdiction, and in line with the Law of the Sea Convention and also general international law. And also very important is the safety of the sea lanes of communications. And this maritime interest, when it was reflected to how China developed its maritime strategy, we don't have really a very concrete document called Maritime Strategy of China. But in 2010, there was a document developed by one of the study of institutions, which elaborate Chinese maritime strategy as enhance the capacity for exploiting marine resources, develop marine economy, and protect the marine ecological environment, and safeguard China's maritime rights and interests. And then last year, and the President Xi Jinping of China, and he put two important concepts. One is to build China into a true maritime power, and the other is to propose the initiative of building a 21st century maritime Silk Road. And to look at the United States, and that is how I understand the maritime interest of the United States. First, freedom navigation doctrine, including merchant vessels and surveying and military ships. And then also the United States very concerned about China's development of the blue water navy and the anti-access, anti-denial capabilities. And certainly, I think it's important for the United States to consolidate its allies in Asia Pacific and other part of the world. And then when we look at the U.S. maritime strategy, and then I can actually try to explore in this way to maintain sea dominance and also keep its important parameter of United States leaderships in the world. It's very interesting, I think in March 13 and this year, and there was a Sea Service of the United States and the Navies and Marine Corps and also Coast Guard actually issue a maritime strategy called the 21st century of Cooperative Strategy for 21st Century Sea Power. And there were three important key words for this document. The first one is forward. Forward naval forces ensure the protection of the homeland far from the shore. And these others engage with allies and partners. And the third key concept is to stand ready to meet the challenge that face in the nation. So it's very interesting. We compare this new document with the 2007 maritime strategy. It's interesting to identify the fact that in the 2007, there's far less focus on China elements in the maritime strategy. But in the new maritime strategy released in March, there is an emphasize all domain assets which will underscore the challenge force faced in assessing operating in contested environments. So China's being without very explicitly identified in the document, but goes without saying China becomes a focus for China's maritime, U.S. maritime strategy. So what's the implication on the Asia-Pacific maritime security? So there are three different possible scenarios. The first one, and I think there's nobody want to see the potential conflict between China and the United States in the South China Sea particularly, which appears unlikely, I believe. And the second scenario, both countries may find a modus vivendi enable them to collaborate to maintain security in the South China Sea. And then the other scenario is that the two countries will maintain a relationship of both cooperation and friction at the same time. And the second divergence between the two countries is how they interpret the 1982 Law of Sea Convention, where China became a party member in 1996, and the United States hasn't ratified it, but it claims that it practiced the principle on the provisions under customary international law. So we are on the same page. So the United States and China actually kind of represent the two different, in some particular area, like in the South China Sea, they represent the two different doctrines. One is the moral liberal versus Mericlosm, which represent the interests of coastal states on from one side, and the other interests will represent the interests of the maritime user states. So to bring to the context of the navigation regime, as the two panelists already explained, there's not too much argument between China and the United States in the navigation regimes in areas such as internal water, territorial sea, and contiguous zone in the strait, and also archipelago, and on the high sea. And even in the EEZ, I think we're on the same page that all the countries enjoy the freedom of navigation as it does on the high sea. But I think that actually the difference actually are whether all types of military activities in the EEZ are actually legitimate and should be regarded as the freedom navigation concept. So there's a lot of concepts a lot of sea people have been working very hardly on, and there's two documents. One's released in 2005 with a bunch of scholars from Japan, from China, from Russia, from the United States, and come up with a very concrete guideline for navigation and overflights in the EEZ of the other countries. And then in 2013, there was a new version to develop from guidelines to principles, but it also reflects the fact that it's very difficult, although we all have the common interest to develop a practical principle, but we still need to figure out what actually works in reality. So the implication on the China-US interaction in the South China Sea from their different interpretation of the law of the sea convention, and then we can try to look at what is the nature of the escalation of South China Sea dispute since 2009. When we look at among the claimant states, we're still looking at old stories such as island regime and the historical competition between historical and modern claims. And there was also other new elements in this situation. For instance, the submissions to the outer limits of continental shelf and different national legislation to consolidate their maritime claims in this region. And going back to the freedom navigation, and then it becomes a very, very frequent concept of words used by many of the foreign ministries from all these countries which are user state of the South China Sea, including Australia, India, United States. So actually going back to the questions, then we ask the question, do any of the claimant states in the South China Sea actually regard the freedom of navigation actually has been challenged in this region? And then I think the answer is not sure. And most of the countries believe that the freedom of navigation is not really a problem. So the difference actually could be interpreted whether all kinds of military activities are actually regarded as freedom navigation. And the third divergence is different legal culture. If we look at the United States has been very actively and dominating and formulating a lot of the international norms and international regulation conventions. And then I think from the 18th century to the first half of the 20th century, the United States has been using very frequent arbitration mechanisms in dealing with its international disputes. And starting from the United Nations after the Second World War, and the United States switched to the ICJ, and so far there are 22 cases with ICJ in terms of international disputes. And for its practice of a maritime dispute, and I have to say there's only one maritime delimitation between the United States and Canada in the Gulf of Maine. And also simply because America is lucky, you have only one neighbor. Unlike China, we are surrounded by so many neighbors. And then to look at China's legal culture. So first, what is the attitude for China towards international law? So we follow all these international norms, regulations, but there's one fact I want to emphasize. If we try to understand Chinese, when you say we follow the international norm, there's two concepts which is very important in formulating Chinese foreign policy in terms of international norms. One is sovereignty. For China, a strict adherence to the principle of inviolability of sovereignty is very important. That's why it's very easy to understand why China it's not easy for them to compromise in the Spratly Islands and in the Nansha Islands. And also China has been very actively participating in the negotiation of 1982 convention, and then also follow with a lot of domestic legislation in the maritime domain following in line with the law of the convention. So what is the practice of dispute settlement? Unlike the United States and China have a very different legal culture, so we want to solve the problem actually between our neighbors through negotiation, especially on the issue of sovereignty and maritime delimitation. But certainly Chinese has been frequent use of other international instruments in terms of its trade disputes, such as WTO. So then the different legal culture, when it's reflected in reality, what is the state practice of international law in the South China Sea management issues? So I would like to spend just 1 or 2 minutes to give you one pictures in the South China Sea and also in Asia, Southeast Asia, and what is the practice the most common practice of maritime dispute settlement or management in this region. And we have different kinds of approach. For instance, the negotiation, we have very successful bilateral negotiations, including the China-Vietnam negotiation and in the Gulf Tonkin, and between Philippines, Indonesia, and other also bilateral through bilateral negotiation. And then we also have jurisprudence. So the two examples will be the case between Malaysia and Indonesia, and between Malaysia and Singapore. And then we have regional approach. For instance, the Indonesia Initiative informal workshop on managing potential South China Sea dispute. And we have also China-ASEAN Maritime Cooperation Fund and the DOC and COC, which is elaborated by Ambassador Chi. And then we also have joint development. For instance, there's a bilateral one between China and Brunei, between Vietnam and Malaysia. So this is, every country is looking for the most appropriate way of dealing its maritime dispute with its neighbors. So we don't actually have a single answer in Asia Pacific, which one that's more appropriate and which one that we are more interested in. To put into the context of the South China Sea arbitration case, and I think most of you are familiar with what are actually the issues in the Philippines versus China arbitration case. And it's simply asking about the legal status of U-shaped line and also the law enforcement in the dispute maritime zone, and certainly the legal status of island regimes. And then just a little bit about what will be the legal and political implication for the arbitration case. For the short term, the actions, the arbitration case itself has increased tensions and delayed the cooperation and progress towards the process of code of conduct. But in the longer term, for the international perspective, it may clarify some legal issues. But the question is, do this possible long-term benefit for maritime security actually outweigh the cost for both term or longer term? And then to give a definition of how a lot of Chinese scholars understand this case, it's simply an example of the interplay of politics and the international law. So there are many divergences actually, despite a lot of divergence, we also have a lot of convergence. Like the first one would be a maritime transport and the climate change challenge and the marine environment degradation associated with the very busy shipping in the South China Sea, and also effect of shipping on human security. And the second convergence would be the navigation regime. Let's take the South China Sea as one example. So in this area, the United States, it's a user state, and China played the dual role as the coastal state and user state. For them, they have a common interest on secure, the slot security and safety, and the secure freedom navigation in this region. So in the Arctic, for example, and both the United States with China as a coastal state, and in this region, United States play a dual role as a coastal states and user states. So they have common interest to actually finding the legal status of the Northwest Passage and also the Northern Sea route in this region. So we do have a lot of common narratives. The third convergence is the traditional role of navies and coast guards for instance, in protecting the sea lanes and maintaining maritime order, and also law enforcement, for instance. And then this is one of the events organized by CSIS, which elaborate how the Coast Guards, Marine Corps, and Navy actually can help coordinate with each other in maintaining the security and safety in the maritime domain. And the last convergence area, and it's actually on the non-traditional security. One of very good example is the anti-piracy in the Gulf of Aden. So a lot of example to prove that we do have a lot of common interest in securing the non-traditional security. So what would be the China-U.S. maritime cooperation mechanism? So this is the political field and the security field, the existing mechanism and dialogue in this from political and security perspective. And we have quite a very good foundation to develop that. And then as Jem has already mentioned, we have this naval confidence building measures from the AMCA, the Qs, and the two most recent agreements. And then we also, back to a very practical question between the United States and China. This is how I identify the two commonalities that we can actually work for on a practical basis. The one is to maintain the sea lanes communication security, and the other is very technical, operational, safety of navigation. So the two questions I would like to raise at the end as a summary of my presentation. The first one is it feasible to develop a Chinese-American instant at sea agreement as a formal rules of interaction going beyond a little bit of confidence buildings only as a formal agreement? And the second question is, would it be China and United States interest to initiate a regional mechanism in line with the safety and security of navigation, such as the instant at sea agreement as a regional mechanism? Well, that's all I want to share with you. Thank you very much.
And a very comprehensive, presentations. You pull out a lot of the theme and the questions, so I think we really like it. So then let me invite our discussant, Professor Song-Yan Hui from Taiwan, to give your comments. Yan Hui, you can move on to the podium. That would be better.
Okay, I'm trying. Well, thank you very much, Professor Zhu, and I would like to thank President Wu Sichun for inviting me to this very important conference. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to listen to the oral presentation. Wonderful. And I do have some questions, like to respond one by one. Now, Professor Nordquist, you're talking about the personal diplomacy, talk about the parallel system, and you talk about the South China Sea workshop process. And that's very important because recently we heard that former Commander-in-Chief, the Pacific Command, Dennis Blair, he proposed to have the International South China Sea Conference. Now we have the South China Sea workshop process meeting began in 1990. Now the recent proposal by Admiral Blair is to have International South China Sea Conference. In that regard, what about a role can be played by the United States? In the past, because the Chinese side, Beijing said that the United States should not be invited to that South China Sea workshop process. Now, what about this new proposal from the U.S. Admiral Blair to have this new international conference on the South China Sea? Is that, in that regard, is any possibility for the cooperation between the United States and China to have this kind of international conference on the South China Sea? In that conference, a number of important legal issues, legal culture, interpretation, implementation, the UNCLOS, and any possibility for maritime cooperation can be discussed. So that's the thing I remember in April 2014 when President Obama went to Manila. And he said that we have disputes with our close allies. But we sit down in a room. It's boring, but we discuss, and we come up with some kind of interesting solution. So that's the thing I think is very important for us to think about future cooperation between United States and China, to have this kind of workshop process, parallel system. We have the South China Sea workshop process led by the Indonesia. Continue, that's good, ASEAN perspective. But can we have a new creative, constructive international conference led by the two largest economy in the world, United States and China? So that kind of the first question. The second one about the SUA Convention. I would like to ask you about the SUA Convention. At this moment, April 10, 2015, the United States, China are not a party to the 2005 protocol to the SUA Convention. And we look at the ASEAN member countries, all of them are non-party to that convention. What's the main reason? Is any possibility for US and China to work together, to promote more ratification of that 2005 protocol to the SUA Convention? So that's the question to you. So, and then come to Professor Kraskas, the presentation, excellent and very good. The three very important non-binding agreements, or the Qs and the two MOUs, right? But my question to you is that when the air-to-air annex will be adopted? This year? Are you sure? When can be adopted? And in that regard, if we look at the MOU signed between the two militaries, the head of the ministry said, indicating that this kind of a MOU subject to confirmation and approval after the agreement on air-to-air annex. So when and what next? And what kind of obstacles or challenges to the future implementation of the MOU, given the fact that there are differences remain in that MOU? I'm talking about non-legal binding forces. I'm talking about the non-prejudice of each other's position regarding military activities in the EEZ. So a lot of kind of challenges, but the last question to you is that Dr. Hong Long mentioned that already. Is any possibility to move from confidence-building measures to agreed agreement, especially MMCA, Military Maritime Consultation Agreement, adopted in 1998? Is that possible to have this kind of agreement to be strengthened and coming to a more legally binding agreement? And that's relevant to Dr. Hong Long's question about any possibility to have a similar 1972, the agreement to avoid accident at sea between the United States and China. And the last question to you is transparency. You mentioned about transparency, it's very important. But you look at the MOU. For that MOU agreed in November last year, indicating that the assessments of the implementation of the MOU cannot be disclosed to the third parties unless written agreement between the parties. Is that right? So what about the transparency? So that's the question. And last one to Dr. Hong Long, and it's, again, it's a very important, this divergence and common interest between the United States and China. But again, what kind of mechanism, maritime cooperation mechanism, you think can be developed? I'm thinking about the possible mechanism is based upon UNCLOS Article 122 and Article 123. Because South China Sea, East China Sea, all of them are semi-enclosed seas. If you look at the semi-enclosed sea, especially Article 123, paragraph 4, other concerned states and international organizations should be invited to participate in that cooperation in the South China Sea, for example. If that's the case, and you mentioned about the user, United States is a user state, right? And the freedom navigation in the South China Sea. If that's the case, is any possibility for the United States to be invited to participate in that kind of regional mechanism to promote maritime cooperation in the South China Sea, including protection, development of living resources, marine scientific research, environmental protection, plus non-traditional security issues, search and rescue, and so on. So, but thank you. I think I went over my time, but thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Yan Hui, for your very concise